Alaska isn't real. This isn't real, this isn't real, and this isn't real. It's just too pretty to be real. As a native Coloradan, I might be a little biased, but I'd say Colorado is the gold standard of natural beauty. After all, I made a YouTube channel just to show you guys how great Colorado is. But Alaska's on a different level. If Colorado's the gold standard, Alaska is the triple platinum standard, and it's well on its way to going iridium. The mountains are bigger, the rivers are bigger, and the fjords are infinitely bigger. Everything is just more. And on some level, I suppose I already knew that. I think most people do. But it's a feeling that's almost impossible to convey through pictures or video. Try though as I may. The simple fact is, you have to be there. But there's a mild downside too. If you go to Alaska, everywhere you go after that, you will compare to Alaska. Consider yourself warned. It wasn't all great though, and my little road trip almost didn't happen at all. I booked a car, landed, and when I went to the desk to pick it up, they told me they didn't have one, and that they wouldn't for months. Of course, being peak tourism season, I glanced at the other clerks. They're all shaking their heads because they don't have anything available either. I thought I was screwed. And I'd like to go on a little bit of a tangent here. I made a booking, I was in the system, they had my phone number, they had my email, and they knew they didn't have any cars. And nobody bothered to let me know. I had to fly 3,000 miles to find out they didn't have a car. Now this didn't turn out to be too much of a problem for me, because I was just winging it anyway. But if I were a couple of parents with 2.5 kids, and had planned and scheduled out the rest of my itinerary, I would have been absolutely screwed. So the budget rental place inside the Fairbanks Airport gets a negative 23 stars out of a possible 5. Luckily somebody told me about Turo, which if you are unfamiliar, is basically Airbnb but for your car. And at the time, there was a grand total of 1 car available in the whole city. And it was this. A 2018 V6 all-wheel drive Dodge Challenger, wrapped like the General Lee. Not a bad car for a road trip, but it was the most conspicuous thing everywhere I went. And ladies, if you need a man between the ages of 45 and 65, get yourself a General Lee. But teachers, don't despair, this car is also very popular in the 12 to 16 demographic. Edgy jokes aside, after taxes and protection plans and all that good stuff, the car cost me $1,200, all said and done, and the guy that was renting it out was very accommodating. So, crisis averted. My flight landed very early in the morning, so I considered just getting a place in Fairbanks for the night. But Fairbanks being Fairbanks in the summertime, there was pretty much nothing available, and if something was available, it was $300 a night. So I decided to head to Talkeetna. It's about a 4.5 hour drive, but it took me a lot longer because I had to stop everywhere to take pictures. One of those stops was Denali National Park, and it was beautiful, because of course it was. But a bit of a pro tip, you really can't drive all that far in, and if you want a good view of Denali, you actually have to take a bus in, which I did not do. However, for $15, what you can drive to and see is absolutely worth it. And all things considered, being a national park in peak tour season, it really wasn't all that crowded. I mean, don't get me wrong, there was a lot of people around, but it wasn't nearly as bad as, say, Rocky Mountain National Park on a Saturday in the middle of summer. And it turns out that was pretty much true everywhere I went. But if you also don't want to catch a bus to see Denali, the good news is there's plenty of places to see it on the way down to Talkeetna as well. After all, it is the tallest mountain in North America. At least that would be the case if the clouds were cooperative, which they weren't. So this was about as good as I could get. For the night, I stayed at the Talkeetna Inn, which I think was about $140 for the night. Pretty nice little spot right on the river. And something I found amusing was that the room had a bug zapper in it, presumably for Alaska's state bird, the mosquito. But the town itself is very tourist-oriented, and I would have liked to spend a little more time there, but alas, I did not. The next day was a drive to Kenai, with a stop in Wasilla so I could pick up some more SD cards, and I gotta say, the stretch between Anchorage and Kenai is iridium standard pretty. Clearly the state knew this, as did everybody else, because there were pull-offs galore for taking pictures, and hell, these guys were even filming something. And due to this, it obviously took me a lot longer than the 5 hours Google said it was going to take me to get to Kenai. Once at Kenai, I stayed at the Uptown Motel and wound up spending $40 on Arby's and $18 on a 6-pack of beer. Now I booked 2 nights in Kenai, which didn't turn out to be a bad thing by any means, but Kenai is more of a working town than a tourist town, so if you wanted to visit the peninsula, I would keep that in mind. And on that note, the next day I decided to take a little day trip to Seward, and again, the drive is iridium level pretty. The main thing I wanted to see in Seward was Exit Glacier, which is inside the Kenai Fjords National Park. And as far as I can tell, it's the only glacier in the park that you can drive to within spitting distance of. There's a couple different hikes up towards the glacier. I didn't take the long one, I just took the one to the overlook, but it's not bad at all. And it was here I took some of my favorite pictures from the trip, including this one, which might be my favorite. After that, it was back to Kenai, where I figured if I was going to spend $40 on food, it might as well be good. And it turns out, the hotel restaurant does a pretty good seafood pasta. The next day was a long drive to Valdez, and again, it took longer than the 8 hours Google said it was going to take, because again, it was very pretty, and I couldn't stop taking pictures, including a couple more of my favorites, which I took about an hour outside of town. In Valdez, I stayed at the Glacier Hotel, where I stayed up too late drinking at the bar. But before I got my drink on, I did some wandering around town, getting my photographing on, in some of the coolest lighting I've ever seen. A competent photographer might have been able to take some award-winning photographs, but alas, I am not one of these, and mediocre will have to do. The next day, thankfully hangover-free, I started my drive towards Delta Junction, and again, it of course took me a lot longer than the 4.5 hours Google said it would. By now you may have noticed a theme, and I'd like to go off on another little tangent about waterfalls. These waterfalls here are just outside Valdez, and if either one of them were in Colorado, they would be a top 10 waterfall. But here in Alaska, they're just waterfalls. And these iridium tier waterfalls are everywhere. There are so many waterfalls, I'd be shocked if most of them had names. So if waterfalls are your thing, you are in luck. Tangent over. As for Delta Junction, it again is more of a working town than a tourist town. And like Kenai, I wound up spending 2 nights there at the Trophy Lodge accommodations. The attached bar seemed to be a pretty popular spot for the locals. At least it was pretty popular when I was there. And the next day I mostly just spent the day around town, taking pictures, and almost losing my drone to a swarm of birds. The next day was the final leg of the trip, just about an hour-and-a-half drive back up to Fairbanks. And for once it actually took me about the same amount of time Google said it would, because I had to get the car back. And that right there, dear viewer, is how I spent a week in Alaska. So some lessons learned. Number 1, a week in Alaska is not nearly enough. 2, if I did just have a week, I'd probably spend it in one town, like Seward or Valdez, and just spend the week seeing everything that was around there. 3, if I were to do a road trip, I wouldn't start it in Fairbanks. The simple fact is that town is only 30,000 people or so, and there just isn't the infrastructure to accommodate the amount of tourists that come through there. That said, winter's not too bad, but I don't know how many people are doing road trips in Alaska in the winter. Number 4, Alaska is expensive. The week probably cost me about $2,000, maybe a little more. There are certainly ways to shave that down a little bit, but there's some things that you just can't get around, and groceries and gas are just going to be expensive anywhere you go, and that's just something you're going to have to eat. Especially Valdez, which is ironic because it's an oil town. Number 5, even if you book something, I would recommend to double check. Make sure that car you ordered is in fact there. I suppose that's probably something I should have known beforehand, but lesson learned. And number 6, I probably wouldn't wing it. I went into this with zero planning whatsoever beyond the booking of a car. And don't get me wrong, it worked out just fine and I had a blast, but I probably would have had a bit more of a blast if I did even a modicum of research before I set off. As far as a couple interesting things I noticed about Alaska in general, 1, a lot of the towns seem to be ultra low density, which is to say you might drive through a town and not even realize it, and zoning laws appear to be non-existent. It seems like a good chunk of the properties are both residential and business. Number 2, the highest speed limit in the state is 65, which is shockingly low for a state that size. At least that's just my opinion, but it appears to be the opinion of everybody else too, because everybody was going much faster than that. Number 3, the ratio of van life vans on the road is absolutely astronomical, and that's coming from a guy that lives in Colorado. Nothing wrong with it, just something I found amusing. Number 4, there are rest stops in the state, and the cleanliness of them varied wildly. If you're on a road trip and you're somebody with a weak bladder or bowels, I would probably take a roll of toilet paper. Number 5, there's a lot of cool stuff along the roads that have been abandoned and make for great photos. For example, this igloo thing. Just remember that a lot of this stuff is on private property, and it is Alaska. And yes, I did get permission to take these pictures. At least insofar as the property caretaker said nobody would stop me if I did. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. I absolutely cannot recommend Alaska enough. The only downside is, now that I've seen some of it, I want to see a lot more. And like I said, anywhere I go, I will probably compare it to Alaska. If you have any questions, fire away. I'll do my best to answer them, and I'll see you for the next video.